Great, welcome. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to all of you who have joined us online. Thank you so much for making the time this evening to join us in this really important conversation that we're going to have. So on behalf of Amnesty International and on behalf of our partner Mail and Guardian, I really want to welcome you to this webinar. And I just want to also thank the panelists who have come who have agreed to join us this evening. So my name is Shamila Mohammed. I'm the Executive Director for Amnesty International South Africa, and I will be your facilitator this evening. Let me introduce the panelists. So we have Renee McFarlane, who is the co-head of research South African CS for the South African Civil Society Organization, Equal Education. We also have Dr. Nick Spall, who's a senior researcher at Stellenbosch University. Thank you so much to the two of you for joining us. And of course, we have our very own Amnesty International's Ian Byrne, who is an international human rights lawyer based at the International Secretariat in London. And Ian actually is the author of our Amnesty report, which is Broken and Unequal, that looks at the state of education in South Africa. So welcome to the three of you. So we're going to start off. I mean, we've had a very difficult year, as we were all talking about earlier, but I don't think anybody's had it more difficult than the schools and the kids, because it's really affected the way in which they the whole year for the whole schooling year has been really badly affected by COVID. So, what in your view, so I'm going to start with you, Nick, maybe you could just give us a brief, your few brief thoughts on, where do you think we are with regards to education in South Africa? We already had an education system that was and is unequal, and then you've added COVID to the mix. So in your view, Nick, where do you feel that we are with the education system at the moment?
Sure. And thanks for hosting this. I mean, I think it's an important discussion. So I think that where we are, as you say, before the COVID pandemic started, it's not as if South African education was in a good space. So the most recent assessments show that about 79% of grade 4 children cannot read for meaning in any language. And we have huge infrastructural challenges. Monitoring survey showed that about half of primary schools in the country don't have any access to the internet. Quarter didn't have running water, electricity. And in that context of very low learning outcomes, very unequal distribution of resources, when the pandemic hit and we closed schools, for most children, they will have lost at least half a year of learning in 2020. So even though they normally wouldn't have learned as much as the curriculum expects from them, and for many that leads to dropout and unemployment, what we've seen is the COVID pandemic is making that inequality worse. I think that it's really held a light up to how unequal South African society is, and also some of the challenges that South African schools have, things like access to the most basic amenities like running water. And I think that's not something that's going to go away as a result of this pandemic, but I do think that it's made us much more aware of what those challenges are.
Where do you
Sorry, it's cutting out a bit. Oh, is it cutting out for other people? Or is it just me?
No, it's also cutting out for me. But Renee, maybe while we're waiting for Shanila to join, do you want to kind of give us the insights from Equal Education? I mean, a lot of your members would be feeling the effects of the pandemic on the ground. What's been some of their insights?
Yeah, I think, Nick, you gave us a good picture of the systemic picture, the problems that South Africa was facing before COVID, and how this period has really intensified that. And what members of Equal Education have explained to us about this period is really what an incredibly difficult time this year was, both academically, because learners really struggled to learn at home. And in fact, I think it's quite an indictment on the DBE's technological revolution that it was introducing with announcing matric results with a robot, and really kind of thinking that that's going to solve all our problems. In fact, what learners were telling us during this period is that for many reasons, they struggled to learn at home. And that was partly because of things like access to devices, access to internet, but it was also about things like digital literacy, about the environments learners found themselves in at home, whether that was conducive to learning, and also because learning is a relational activity, and also depends on the relationship between learners and teachers, and also with their peers. Another big issue that was highlighted during this time by learners was the impact of the closing of the school nutrition program. And it really stepped in to challenge the DBE's decision to close down that program during this time, because we were hearing really difficult testimonies from learners about experiencing hunger during this time, that which overshadowed any challenges with learning. And I think that decision by the department actually highlights a broader systemic issue, which is firstly the fact that the department is very inflexible. It's not easy for the state bureaucracy to firstly introduce new programs to address problems, but also to even adapt existing programs to deal with a crisis situation like the situation we had during COVID.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. So I think Shanila,
and you wrote a report earlier this year.
So I just say Shanila's having to drop off. So but I think Nick, you're doing a great job at moderation. So I think you should carry on.
We've all been in so many of these Zoom meetings that we sort of know what the protocols are.
Yeah, unlike the government, we have to try and be flexible and innovative. So I think you asked me about the report earlier in the year.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sort of, what do you see of those similarities? Are we just saying the same old issues we've always been saying are wrong in South Africa, or do you think that COVID has added new complexities to the mix?
Well, I think it is a bit of both, because as I said, we put this report out in February, and that was based on a couple of years research going out on various missions. And of course, as we made clear, and I made clear at the time, it said really nothing new. It really built upon the fantastic work that Equal Education, Section 27, academics like you, Nick, have already done. But what it showed was, it was in the title, it was a broken system for many and a very unequal system. And we focused a lot on the infrastructure, just taking footage of some of the schools we were visiting in Gauteng and the Eastern Cape. The lack of sanitation, the pit toilets that still exist, the lack of running water. And as already been said, I think COVID has just exacerbated, hasn't it, those inequalities in two ways. I think one, as Renee said, and we touch upon this in the briefing, which will be coming out shortly, is the lack of access to any form of remote or blended learning for many of those children in those schools that tend to serve the poorer communities, the sort of lower quintile schools. And then if schools can reopen, if and when they do reopen, are they really as safe as they can be? Can they meet the government's guidelines on social distancing when you've got very overcrowded classrooms already, crumbling infrastructure? Can they meet the guidelines on sanitation and hygiene when you've got very poor quality sanitation, sometimes no running water? I think the South African Human Rights Commission, which we referenced in the briefing, did a survey, and it showed very low numbers in some of the provinces in terms of percentage of schools that still don't have running water, which we take as a basic fundamental right. So when you've got that context, then it is not surprising that COVID, as you said, is exacerbating those inequalities. And at the same time, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, you've got the government diverting, what was it, about 2 billion rand in June away from the infrastructure education grant. And then you've got the overall budget just being announced in the medium-term policy statement towards the end of last month, when it seems that the budget overall for the Department of Education is going to stay flat, which obviously, taking into account inflation, will see a year-on-year decrease. And I think there are issues that Renee raised about the bureaucracy, about the failures around allocation of resources and logistics. But there's also obviously a basic issue around, is the government making the right decisions about prioritizing resources, given the special status that education has in the Constitution?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think something that I found really remarkable is how the lack of physical infrastructure, particularly water, is something that's been with us for, since the transition. That every single president has promised that we're going to transform the schools and get rid of the mud schools, give water and electricity to all schools, etc. And this has been an elusive promise for every single one of these presidents that have preceded us. And yet, if we believe the minister's numbers that she put forward based on the partnership that they had with Rand Water and a few other partnerships, all you need is urgency and consequences, and suddenly every single school, just about 99% of schools, according to the minister, have access to some kind of running water, whether that's through tanks or connections, etc. It was just so remarkable to me that this perennial problem that seemed impossible to fix suddenly within 6 months evaporated when the department realized that they absolutely had to get this done, or there would be no schools whatsoever. Yeah. So I'm quite keen to hear from you, Renee. I mean, equal education's been at the forefront of all of these infrastructure challenges with the department. How much of this is a lack of funding? How much of it is just a lack of political will and urgency?
Yeah, definitely. Equal education members have over the years been obviously highlighting the lack of urgency from the state. They went as far as to challenge EE in court when we tried to get them to pass regulations to say what a school must have. And when we were worried that there were some loopholes in the law, they challenged us again when we tried to challenge those loopholes in court. So the DBE has gone to lengths to avoid accountability on infrastructure. They have also in the past struggled with expenditure. We've had, on the one hand, the decrease in infrastructure budget is definitely an incredible concern for equal education, and should be for all of us if we want to see safe school infrastructure. But some of that decrease has also resulted in the past where the department hasn't come through with properly spending its budget. So the department also really has to improve its own delivery. And I think that while your point is definitely important, look what could happen when it was actually a crisis and the department didn't have a choice to deliver. I think we also mustn't underestimate the cost at which that came, in the sense that if you had addressed this problem before COVID happened, you would have had long-term solutions in place. Now what we had was the department actually reprioritizing around 4 billion rand, which was supposed to fund permanent solutions. and used it to provide temporary solutions, which, like, for instance, the tanks that they've provided have to continue being refilled, and that's very expensive and probably won't happen. A lot of the toilets they delivered were temporary toilets. And so I think this period has actually shown us the consequences of having dragged our feet this long to solve this problem, and now being forced to kind of put stopgaps in place to deal with the crisis. But I do think, and you know, to throw it back to you, I think you've done important work to highlight how education expenditure has actually decreased over years on things in addition to teacher salaries. And I think, you know, as a country, we really need to pay attention to, now it's not even hidden in the budget. Now we are actually seeing that year on year, our education budget is set to decrease when you take inflation into account. And it's almost unthinkable how we can solve some of these really important problems without that expenditure. But it's also making it all the more important that we hold the state accountable, for instance, for how it holds contractors accountable when they do poor work and waste our money, when there's irregular or wasteful expenditure. Like, we don't have cents to waste in that way.
Definitely. And Renee, I think you're totally right in pointing out the fact that these temporary solutions have diverted money from potential long-term sustainable solutions. So it's sort of, even when there's a potential silver lining, it turns out that in this COVID cloud, there is no silver lining. It's just sort of depressing stat after depressing stat. And I think that that stat you mentioned at the end around declining real per learner expenditure, which we are seeing in South Africa historically for the last 10 years, but increasingly going forward, given these real declines in overall expenditure, but particularly per learner expenditure. I think those dynamics are really going to start biting now as we move into COVID, that where they were sort of not totally known and under the surface, I think are now going to start creating some tidal waves. And already we're seeing this with the unions and the way that they are, COSATU's interacting with the ANC around wage negotiations and saying, we don't actually care about these budget cuts that you're introducing. You cannot renege on certain wage negotiations, irrespective of the fiscal situation. And I think that's going to be especially prominent in education. As soon as this 3-year contract comes up for renewal, and they need to renegotiate what's going to happen. Are we going to let some teachers go, which has never happened, this sort of mass firing of teachers, or is the real expenditure on teachers, their salaries, going to come down? Or will the department pivot and shift some of its LTSM expenditure towards teachers, which are some early and they are doing this, that we have a Limpopo textbook scandal in the making right now. And that it's very possible that some provinces next year will not have LTSM. And I believe that there are certain undertakings with certain provinces to make sure that there are textbooks that are available to learners, because that's something that should have already been resolved now for next year. And I think that there are going to be big wake-up calls next year. But Ian, you look like you had a comment on that particular one as well.
Well, I don't know if I did, but I mean, I think, you know, the fundamental point is governments always have choices. Sometimes your room for maneuver is less, and I think we've seen that a bit during COVID, both in terms of how you pay to try and cover, you know, various schemes. And I know that there's been various social assistance schemes being put in place in South Africa. We touch on this in the briefing because I think, you know, sometimes we look at issues in silos. And I think part of the thing is also looking at how education links up with other rights. And obviously we look at these things, as you do, very much from a human rights point of view, linking it to livelihoods as well as health, etc., and the impacts that that's having cumulatively. But I think, as you said, when you look at some of the decision making that the government has taken, have they really looked at all the alternatives, and using a kind of human rights approach. And the Special Rapporteur on Education issued a briefing that we reference in our report, and she issued this earlier this year, and looking at it from a human rights point of view. And we're often asked, what is the added value of rights? But I think a lot of what we've been talking about, accountability, transparency, non-discrimination, trying to address the inequalities in the system and applying a more human rights approach should be able to kind of bring you benefits. But I think when you're seeing state-owned enterprises like South African Airways getting a big bailout, and then that seems to be at the expense potentially of basic education infrastructure, then I think you have to ask, and I know you and others in the media have been asking hard questions about the government's choices. It is very difficult, and we recognize that in the report. Having to deal with issues under a pandemic on this scale, certainly, and I think in Western, and it's been a wake-up call for Western Europe, because I think often we've seen epidemics in Africa, and that seems distant, and governments are wrestling and struggling with it. But this global pandemic on such a scale, and the fact it's lasting so long, governments are facing challenges, but I think we also have to call them out. Call them out in terms of good governance, and also call them out in terms of the human rights obligations that they've got. And again, coming back to the fact that sort of somewhat special status that the courts have recognized for the right to education under the Constitution, even compared to some other social rights. And the fact that it seems to have been, I wouldn't say neglected, but it certainly didn't seem to have been as prioritized with some of the government's fiscal choices that they've been making during the past few months. Yeah.
And I can see they've launched a poll, if people want to vote on it. Did governments do enough to ensure that schools were safe for reopening? So if you want to vote on that. And I also see Mandy Olivier in the chat is asking about this increased spend on education is critical, but where do we propose that money comes from? Money can't exceed money that's coming in the long run. And specifically, do we think that free higher education is sustainable given the high dropout rates in first year? What can basic education do to reduce first year dropout rates? I think if I can start with that one, Ian's point that governments make decisions about what they choose to prioritize is abundantly clear. In the Zuma government, of which we are all now all with bated breath seeing how that particular saga is panning out in South Africa. But when it was in its heyday and we got free higher education, that was at the expense of other social spending. The choice to spend money on higher education and make it free for the students that get in was a political choice, and the proponents of it would defend it. But it does mean that there's an ongoing additional expenditure that's going to higher education. That means that it's not available, for example, to go to basic education or to other social spending. And I think that that's a really important point in the long run. And it's something that a lot of Treasury officials said at the time, was that this is not a once-off decision that's only affecting this financial year or this medium-term expenditure framework. It's actually going to be a long-term reprioritization of social spending towards higher education, which is not as progressive as basic education does. So I think we are, again, starting to the chickens are coming home to roost with some of these decisions that were made a long time ago, both in terms of infrastructure, where we see that the lack of action, as Renee and others mentioned, the lack of action in the past, when a pandemic hits and you now need to wash your hands to not transmit this virus, where at least when we thought that was the primary way it was being transmitted, suddenly we weren't able to do that. What are all of the ways that our current level of underpreparedness, and not just physical underpreparedness, but general lack of basics in place in basic education, are putting us at risk for the next 10 years? Things like access to basic literacy, things like not having extreme class sizes. These are really critical things that are not nice to haves. They're not like high five, well done government for doing this. These are the things that are really need to be in place if we aren't to have extreme vulnerability to things like a global pandemic. And I think now that one of these things has actually happened, it's not just a hypothetical. We would hope that the government, there would be a wake-up call to say, we don't have a choice anymore. We absolutely have to meet the minimum criteria of water, sanitation, electricity in schools, at least in schools, and eliminate extreme class sizes. There should be no school in South Africa that has classes in excess of 60 people. And yet that is our lived reality at the moment. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Mandy, but let me see if Renee and Ian also have any comments on that, on those topics.
I wanted to add one thought, Nick, which was that one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that, as Ian explained earlier, that during the supplementary budget, government actually reallocated funding from basic education to other departments because education wasn't seen as what it called at the time a frontline service. And I think that really speaks to the extent to which people underestimate the broad role that schools play in society. For many of Equal Education's learner members, schools were the places where they accessed meals, and for some learners, that was the only meal of the day. Often they had better access to water and sanitation than they had in their community. They often talked about, now that they're at home, there being intermittent access to water because the community isn't supplied with proper access to water, access to things like electricity, access to social services. Often schools are the point where other things like, for instance, vaccinations happen. Schools play a really important role in the social development of learners. And so I think that the very narrow understanding of education and all the things that the education budget actually has to cover is a really important thing for us to consider when we think about education funding. The fact that it, for instance, also goes to feeding learners, which is an absolutely critical thing. And we saw the consequences of cutting that during the lockdown period. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate what you also said about these aren't things that are nice to have. And when the department can choose to allocate a year's worth of infrastructure spending, school infrastructure spending, to the South African Airways, you really have to ask hard questions about how political decisions are made. And it emphasizes the importance of putting this issue of education spending at the forefront of people's minds as we head into February and the minister tabling the next budget, and making sure that, we're all cognizant of the consequences that has on the ground for learners and in schools.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think, in the human rights world, we talk about the indivisibility of rights, don't we? And the interdependence of right. And it goes right back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And it's there also in your constitution. But what does that mean in practice? It does mean, as I was saying earlier, and Renee has just articulated very well, how all of these things are interlinked and the central role that education can play in those other benefits to society. I mean, I'll just quote again what the UN Special Rapporteur earlier said this year. The crisis has forcefully demonstrated the central role of educational institutions in our societies. That is not so only with regard to implementing the right to quality education for all, but in terms of ensuring a number of social services for the benefit of the most marginalized, etc., etc. So, exactly what you were saying, but in practice, and that's what's happening. And these schools are at the heart of communities, but they've suffered precisely because of the types of communities they serve and the ways that those communities have been marginalized over decades. And as you said, Nick, the chickens do come home to roost. And that's why, we wanted to do this follow-up briefing that's coming out very shortly to look at what has been the impact of COVID, but also the government's response. And, and I think the government, we're not here to totally give the government a kicking. I think they have done some things, what I can see from the outside. There has been some limited remote learning, but again, that is often predicated on, again, where you are. I know they've worked a bit with the SABC, but when as you said, you put it in the context of just lack of access to information technology, lack of training for teachers, on how to deliver remote or blended learning, even if the technology is there, you will see obviously private schools, unsurprisingly, tending to do much better, as well as probably the wealthier public schools. So all of the things, all of the inequalities that you guys have worked on for years and that we've started to look at Amnesty are just really played out and exacerbated during this time. If you don't have a plan, or if your plan is not so much, is not really getting to the heart of some of the problems. I know the president made a very important announcement back in mid-October about now finally committing to end all mud schools and address inadequate sanitation in thousands of schools. Again, let's see what happens. We know that many, many promises have been made in the past, but the government is still failing its own targets on the minimum standards, isn't it? So, and you can read the audit. There's been some very critical audits that we reference in the briefing in Parliament this year, again, where the government's having to admit that it's not doing as well as it can do. So I think, we need to have this wider debate, as you said, about the value of education and the fact that if you're a young person, I think there was like 59 days on average were being missed by the end of August. That's a huge impact upon that relatively limited time you've got as a young person to benefit from education and personal development. And it can lead us, effectively to a lost generation, to kids that maybe won't get their matric, increasing youth unemployment, all of these things that's being impacted on the system. So yes, there are questions about how you pay for things, but it is also an investment in the country's future, because they are the future of the country. They are going to be the future taxpayers, the future workers, and you need to invest in them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just to Renee and both you mentioned this idea of the indivisibility of human rights. I think one of the things that we've done in South Africa recently, which I think the listeners here might be keen to know about, is that the South African Human Rights Commission is currently going through a process of developing and articulating a right to read. So there's a right to basic education in the Constitution, and it has these special protections that it's not subject to the availability of resources, etc. But what we wanted to do and I'm part of that Section 11 committee that's helping define what that right to read and write looks like, is to articulate what a right to a basic education looks like. So the minimum norms and standards have done a great job at saying, on an infrastructural level, this is what is needed for the right to a basic education to be realized. But I think one of the next steps we need to make as a country is to say, what does it look like for the educational outcomes of the right to a basic education to have been realized? What kind of text should a child be able to read, and what kind of questions should they be able to answer for us to say that their most basic right, the right to learn how to read in your home language and to write in your home language, has been realized? So I think that's a really interesting development. I mean, it hasn't been finalized yet, and I think it would only be launched next year. But it does also ask me to force me to ask myself these questions about, is the thing that we lack a more articulate or explicated law around what a right to basic education is? Or is our binding constraint a lack of political will, lack of political consequences when our poorer and more dysfunctional provinces don't have the state capacity to deliver on their mandate of eliminating mud schools or training teachers or providing textbooks and graded readers to all learners? At the moment, there are very few tangible consequences to a inept, useless government official who's in a high-ranking position. Whether they deliver or don't deliver, as long as they don't do something illegal, they won't lose their job. And in most instances, even if they do something illegal, they won't lose their job. I mean, we will hopefully see some more people losing their jobs with the Zondo Commission wrapping up and criminal charges being laid on more than just the former president. But I think that the bigger issue here is to ask ourselves what we should be doing as a country. What do we think is the lack in basic education that if it was resolved, it would lead to change? And I can see Jenny Wells has asked a question, which I'm going to frame towards Renee. How can we as active citizens hold our government accountable to delivering on their promises? What's our role in fixing the broken and unequal education system? Practically. Renee, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, I think that's such a big question because it also depends on what one's skills is and bringing those skills and to work for the benefit of the education system. I personally am a huge fan of school governing bodies as a real opportunity for any member of the public to be actively involved in the education system. I think it's a underutilized avenue, and few people know that anyone can be co-opted onto a school governing body. So that's one way in which, when people want to contribute, I think one can make a really important impact in the education system. I think we mustn't underestimate the power of mobilizing around important education issues, whether your skill is to find yourselves in the streets and join Equal Education for a protest, or whether it's to contribute to public conversations in the media. I think South Africa's history is a powerful example of, or has many powerful examples of, how important it is to keep making the points that we feel strongly about, even if it feels like it takes long to implement. So I really think that we have to continue highlighting the importance of education and the various elements, as Nick said, the various elements that really need to come together to realize learners' rights to education. We need to make sure that oversight bodies are also playing their role. We've got parliamentarians who are getting paid huge salaries to make sure that the executive fulfills its responsibility, and often parliamentary meetings are completely useless. In fact, EE has a great story where we found out that the Parliament was going to elect as chair to the Education Committee someone that had been convicted of fraud in the Eastern Cape. And just before they got elected, we managed to get her completely booted out of Parliament. And that was a rare example of accountability that is actually possible, but it requires the public to pay attention to what's happening and to raise questions when things go wrong. Provincial legislatures are a huge underutilized space. Anyone can write to a provincial legislature to raise issues that are happening in the province and to engage those committees on holding the state accountable. I think there are incredible NGOs that are doing work to almost compensate for where the state isn't doing its part. And one should laud those efforts. But in the end, if we want to see systemic change, we do also need to find ways to really push the state to build its own capacity to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just go in as well. I mean, I think, again, all of this, again, speaks to, what we call a human rights approach. But the challenge we often face as human rights advocates is how you make it real. So the notion of accountability that Renee has just very, very comprehensively addressed, transparency, participation, all of those sort of fundamental cross-cutting principles should, if they're working well, and if they're embedded in your different layers of government, should provide a better ultimate service for the public. When I first came to South Africa, we worked quite closely with NASGB, because we could see that they fulfilled this kind of interesting role. They weren't sided with the teachers, they weren't the teaching unions, they weren't part of government, but they were there to ensure better governance within the schools. Now, we know they face many challenges. They often lack resources and training for their members, again, particularly for the poorer schools. So, the better schools will tend to get the middle class people, I'm sure, who are quite active, who've got the resources, who do the fundraising. And then you've got the people who are really trying. And I was, terribly impressed with the amount of time that people put in as NASGB members. And they helped us to kind of do a huge survey across the country to kind of look at some of these issues. Obviously, you have a very dynamic court system in South Africa, you know, that very early on has been adjudicating on social economic rights. But are there the sanctions there for officials that refuse to comply? Often, you know, in other jurisdictions like India, you often have officials being held in contempt of court. Now, for some people, that might seem quite drastic, but it is quite, it focuses your mind if you're an official that keeps coming back to court and says, well, what have you done to implement my court order on lack of sanitation in schools or the food feeding program? And they say, well, I haven't really done anything in the last 3 months. And they say, well, that's not good enough and you're going to face a sanction. So that it does need to be maybe tougher accountability structures in place, I think, you know, to ensure that ultimately you get the kind of government that you should get in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going back a little bit on your the legal example of using India with the consequences, which is, and I always say this to my lawyer friends, that you can't legislate a functional state. And basically, there are always unintended consequences. So with those sorts of things, where we've experimented with it a little bit in South Africa, you also end up with very risk-averse behavior. And with government officials like so afraid of kind of stepping foul of the financial regulations around procurement, for example, or tendering, that it becomes so onerous to actually do it that they stay away from it. So I think that it's almost like cooking a meal and figuring out what's the right level of spice. But if the meat is rotten, you know, we can't just like keep dumping in more salt until this thing is thinking that it's going to fix the problem. But I wanted to pivot. There's another question. There are two questions, and I think it's quite a funny left-right combo in the chat here. One is from Kaya and one is from Inkosinati. So Inkosinati says, if you were the Minister of DBE, what would your strategy be to turn public schools around? What would you prioritize? And I was starting to think about this question and thinking, oh, you know, I would probably prioritize early grade reading, make sure that you've got a specific, measurable, actionable goal, get everyone to work behind this, etc., etc., etc. And then Kaya has a question. In the schooling sector, we need the most dynamic, hardworking, energetic minister, and the same requirements for MECs. And I think why I thought it was quite funny is that what Kaya doesn't add there is the political backing, connections, union buy-in, etc. And as much as we think these are technical problems that need to be resolved, ultimately you cannot resolve a political problem with a technical solution. We can't come at this and look at it and think that the reason why we are in the absolute mess that we are in education is just because of technical issues around incompetent people being appointed and people not evaluating programs and spending money on nonsense bullshit programs that they shouldn't be spending money on. That's not it, right? It's clearly there are political problems behind this, that the president, for example, might say that he cares about education, but where's the money that actually backs up that statement? Where's the reallocation of the budget to say, I'm putting my most powerful and influential minister to be the Minister of Basic Education, for example, that has the highest buy-in from the rest of the ANC, from COSATU, from the union, etc., because they need to implement a whole bunch of really difficult reform. And the only way that's going to be possible is if we have a really big guy of all of the education department. So that's a long way of saying that to Nkosinati's answer, if I were the Minister of Basic Education, what would I do? I would resign on day one and recognize that I'm the wrong person to be doing that. And instead saying to the president, if you were serious about this, go and find one of these people that is your most competent minister and don't allocate them to treasury or to health in this particular context. Allocate them to basic education with a very strong reform mandate. But until we have that political backing, which, to be frank, we don't at the moment, we can't be thinking that a whole bunch of technical fixes is going to get us to where we want to go.
Nick, I want to respond to your point because I think you missed an important part of Kaya's question, which is also the MECs, which is a really important point because you can have a minister that has the strongest reform mandate in the history of South Africa. You've got this complicated bureaucracy where you've got 9 provincial MECs who are also making their own decisions, which I think we sometimes underestimate how complicated that makes effecting change in the education system. And it's also why, when I spoke earlier, I highlighted the importance of provincial legislatures, because we have such a massive focus on national parliament and our national ministers, and there is so little interaction in provincial legislatures and accountability for provincial governments. And if you think about the incredible power vested, for instance, in a premier, in the Eastern Cape, there was a time when we were rolling through through heads of department, because every now and again we had the MEC was unhappy with some political stance of the HOD. And those complicated layers of government is something that you have a national scholar transport policy, but every province will now go and develop its own scholar transport policy. And if you want to fix scholar transport in the country, you have to figure out what's happening in every province and what the different regulations are in every province. And obviously that's true for whether it's reading or whatever. And so I really think that we don't pay enough attention to provincial governments and the really crucial role they play in delivering accountability. The fact that they spend the bulk of the country's finances, and that we really have to hold them accountable.
Definitely. And Renee, I think it reiterates the point that we need the same logic at the provincial level that we have at the national. So if a premier is serious about education in their province, they really need to pick an MEC who's particularly strong and has a vision and is really committed to delivery on that particular topic, rather than thinking of education like we think of DSD or the Department of Women and Children and these things as what are perceived to be nice to have, as opposed to really core functional delivery mechanisms of the state. Definitely. Let's see if there are any other questions.
Nick, while you are looking for another question, can I come in with a contribution?
Sure.
I wanted to make the point that I think that COVID highlighted for us also that while some of the challenges that our education system faces are really complex and difficult to solve, our government has struggled to do fairly simple things, like, for instance, during COVID, communicating properly what their plans are. It's a problem that predates COVID. We saw it, for instance, when the department changed criteria, whether you have to pass maths to pass your grade, and everyone thought you can now pass maths with 20%. When the department started talking about a grade 9 certificate and accidentally framed it as a school leaving certificate, and everyone was now like, you're leaving school in grade 9, or with the sex education policy where there was all this confusion about what's changed. Oh, actually, it's been implemented long before, and, And I think the department has really underestimated the importance of communication in actually implementing its own plans. For instance, during COVID, you had a situation where it was absolutely critically important to keep the public up to date about evolving science around COVID, what the implications were for returning to school and how it plays out in the school context, for convincing the public that you've done enough to make schools safe for them to return to school. Instead, there was absolute confusion, the department would change the school reopening day a day before schools were set to reopen. I was in contact with teachers who had absolutely no idea what was going on. Never mind the fact that some learners had to travel across provinces to go back to school. And I just think that sometimes the department can, or the various education departments can hide behind the complexity of the situation, which I think we all acknowledge that there isn't one silver bullet. But there are instances like that where it really shows like almost that the state really isn't willing to do the bare minimum and get their act in order on things that don't require systemic change. They actually just require a bit of thought and effort.
Totally. Renee, I'm 100% with you. I think that there is no excuse why for the government not to be able to deliver on extremely simple things, like being able to communicate and having protocols around clear communication to teachers and parents around COVID. But we could say the same thing about infrastructure. How difficult is it to say that in 25 years, yes, you've got thousands of schools, but providing water and electricity to prioritized sites, 25,000 prioritized sites across the country, and yet the department can't do this. We can host the World Cup. We've got some of the best universities on the continent. We can do all sorts of things, but to provide simple things like water and electricity or communication to parents, the department seems to be lacking. And this is why I do think that as a civil society sector, we need to start looking for solutions and looking for explanations that move beyond trite examples of there's a lack of capacity. Why is there a lack of capacity, and why hasn't the government done something about it? There's a lack of funding. Why is there a lack of funding, and why hasn't the government done something about it? A lot of those things will lead us back to political roots and political sources rather than thinking of these technical symptoms as being the real issue. So I am going to wrap it up after Ian has a one comment that he can make as his closing comment. And then we'll wrap it up in the next 5 minutes. Ian?
Sorry, I dropped off, which just goes to show, doesn't it, that maybe the delivery of services and resources in the UK is not so great. But look, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion for me. You know, I'm conscious very much. You know, I'm an outsider that's looking in from the outside, and I think sometimes that brings a useful perspective. I certainly learned a lot more about South African education in the last couple of years that I've been researching it. And I think which I think this call has reflected is maybe there are no easy solutions. Sometimes it is more complex than we think. And I've, you know, having read quite a bit of your writings, Nick, you know, that certainly helped to expand my knowledge and understanding. And I realize when we work in human rights, as you said, it's quite easy to say, you know, the government must uphold the right to education. But what does that mean in practice? And I think definitely, you know, when you've got the kind of nexus, the complexity of you know, various political power in the country, and how that might play out in terms of good governance, then obviously that is going to be a factor. I think all we can do in civil society is continue to point out the deficiencies, try and come up with, I think, practical solutions. And I know, again, Nick and you, Renee, as well, both in both of your respective fields, you've done great work in that. And I think we're always conscious of that amnesty across all the work that we do across the world. It's easy to say what government shouldn't be doing. It's sometimes more harder to say what they should be doing. But I think, as you said, that, you know, there are basics. There are some basics there in terms of when you look at the state of some of the infrastructure. You know, my son's school in South London had quite a few issues, but, you know, when I compare it to even just buildings that don't have the basic fabric, you know, no desks, even no equipment, no furniture, these, as you said, massive overcrowding in classes, then it makes it very difficult to deliver any education, whether under a pandemic or not. So I think, you know, the government's really got to get some of, as you said, some of those fundamental rights, and we need to continue holding them to account. We will continue to hold the president to account about what he said about mud schools and pit toilets, and let's hope this time it may be a different story, but clearly still a long way to go.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. And I'm going to just leave everyone. I've just posted something in the chat. It's an article of a series that Nature has been publishing on evidence and how evidence does or doesn't inform policymaking. But I think that it touches on a lot of what we've been speaking about, that as civil society, we also need to wisen up and say that the ways that we hold government accountable need to become more sophisticated over time. And that we can't just carry on with our regular same old strategies and wonder why they're not working. Then we have to start introspecting and saying, how can we be more strategic? How can we actually try and better understand the root cause of why there's a lack of change over time? And I think this article touches on some of those, that we need to be making sure that evidence is made available to decision makers in ways that they understand, but also through the channels that they trust. Working with knowledge brokers, working with the media and narratives, and moving beyond a simplistic understanding that just once they know what the right thing is, they'll do the right thing. I don't think any of us think that anymore, if we ever did. But likewise, just knowing what their rights obligations are has not and likely will not lead them to just do their jobs. There are reasons why they're not doing that, and we need to understand why if we want it to change. So of the people that have joined us for this 55-minute webinar, thanks. I'm sure that hopefully our impromptu three-way conversation has been helpful. And I really want to just ask and recommend and prompt and prod everyone to start thinking about these things in fresh ways, and specifically to try and get a better understanding of the politics behind what's leading to this particular equilibrium, because it is an equilibrium. It's not just a shitty outcome that we stumbled upon. There are forces that keep us in the same place, and understanding those forces that keep us in the same place is necessary if we are to change. So thanks to Ian, and thanks to Renee, and thanks to Mail and Guardian and Amnesty International. But I think we can wrap it up there. I don't know how to close this, but I'm assuming that someone does know. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Nick, for your impromptu chairing.
Sure. Cheers, everyone.